The Game of Thrones universe has become a very successful franchise even after the disaster that the last season of Game of Thrones was. Let's not talk about it. I used to be actually a huge fan of Game of Thrones, like a huge fan. But that last season was so legendarily bad that I just forgot about it. But House of the Dragon and A Night of the Seven Kingdoms are popular TV shows. I'm watching them, I'm enjoying them, are already leaving their mark in the international cultural zeitgeist, even though the impact of those two shows isn't as impactful as it was the TV show Game of Thrones. These TV shows, they're all based on the medieval high fantasy book series A Song of Ice and Fire, created by George R.R. Martin, brings new tropes and perspectives to a world building that's not only so foreign to us knights, lords, medieval inspired customs and social classes, nobility, monarchy, and imperialism. In this episode, we will explore the tropes of imperialism and monarchy in the Game of Thrones universe. I will focus mainly on the TV series, but I will also use A Song of Ice and Fire wiki in case I need to quickly confirm some information that might not be presented in the show very accurately or clearly, because I think is important for context here. This episode is not meant to be a deep analysis on the immensely vast, huge A Song of Ice and Fire universe. There are enough talented content creators who have produced hundreds of hours of in depth analysis of the books, even reading the blogs of George R.R. Martin, watching the interviews following him, the actors, the producers, etc. And some of these content creators I've watched, I will share the links of these content creators that have helped me a lot to refresh my mind when writing this script. So they're both on TikTok and YouTube. And while you at it, please don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments if you consider yourself a fan of either the books or the TV shows, even if you haven't watched the TV shows or read the books, or even if you don't like any of George R.R. Martin work, let me know why. And also, I promise you that you will get something out of this episode. I promise you. I like the TV shows, even though some of the themes included are too much for my personal taste. Too much gratuitous violence, specifically against women. The A Song of Ice and Fire universe is full of morally great characters and that it is intentional. George R.R. Martin means for this world to be so violent and cruel because he wants to present a non glamorized version of war, of conquest. He wants to deconstruct the medieval fantasy genre and strip it of its black and white morality. That being said, it is not necessary to include so much hate. My exploration of how imperialism and monarchy as systems are represented in this fantasy world are not about morality, but how A Song of Ice and Fire universe is not the exception, but just part of the ruling media when it comes to how to treat. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and comment and share this episode. I also read your comments at the end of each episode, so especially for this episode, I want to read your thoughts. And you might be wondering, why am I wearing pink hair? I will tell you in the comments. And also, I have a Patreon where I have exclusive content and I also talk about why am I wearing a pink wig. Let's start talking about medieval fantasies. Medieval fantasy is central in the Western cultural zeitgeist. Almost no one can resist stories inspired by the European medieval times. Its charm, customs, and romanticizing of the world is just irresistible. King Arthur legend has become the inspiration of countless of tales, stories, media, art, book series, plays, and even the creation of whole genres like high medieval fantasy. Another important piece of media in the high medieval fantasy genre is the 1981 epic dark medieval fantasy film Excalibur. So for my Patreons, I will be watching the film for the first time and react to it. The medieval world is such an interesting base for this genre. You have the fashion, the absence of modern technology, which creates the paradox of a limited world full of possibilities, a small world with a very rigid class system, like in feudal societies, while at the same time having the limitless possibilities of magic. The genre of medieval fantasy is not meant to challenge the class structures that rules it, which brings suffering to those at the bottom of the class hierarchy. There are few of those who are lucky enough to improve their social standing, but their stories don't challenge this rigid class system. I will talk more about them later in this episode, so put a pin on this. Why can't we imagine a world where a woman walks into a huge fire pit with three dragon eggs, raised from the ashes unburnt, with three living dragons? But we can't imagine a world without rigid class systems. Why can't we imagine a world where someone can be resurrected, raised from the death, but not a world without imperialism? Why can we imagine a world where someone can live like hundreds of years, but we can't imagine a world without monarchy? I think it's because we have consumed those ideas since we can remember for generations. I personally prefer medieval fantasy than futuristic fantasy. I know it sounds ironic, but I find futuristic fantasy kind of annoying because I see a specific type of propaganda. But this episode is not about futuristic fantasy. But let me know in the comments if you would like me to make a video sharing my thoughts about futuristic fantasy. A Song of Ice and Fire universe is a darker presentation of the high fantasy genre with morally great characters where chivalry and honor are constantly challenged, mocked, and even sometimes punish. However, this universe is also full of magic, dozens of different cultures, languages, creatures, and countries. Then why cannot this world exist without imperialism? Now let's talk about romanticizing imperialism. Aegon the Conqueror is the father of the Targaryen dynasty in Westeros, earning the title of Conqueror because of his imperialist conquest of Westeros, together with his sister wives and the power of dragons, which without them, the Targaryens wouldn't have been able to conquer and rule six kingdoms. This is very important because we know how Dorne joins the Seven Kingdoms is through diplomacy, but I'm going to talk more about it later in this episode. Aegon the Conqueror imperialist enterprise is represented as necessary to unify Westeros and protect it from the coming long night. Aegon decided to conquer Westeros because of a dream he had. It is hinted in the books and TV shows that this dream has to do with the prophecy of the prince that was promised, who will fight the Night Walkers and save the world from the long night. House of the Dragon, Viserys explains this prophecy explicitly to Rhaenyra. The pain, destruction, and subjugation that came with the imperialist wars of Aegon Targaryen were a necessary evil, so Westeros and thereafter the known world in this fantasy universe could survive the threat of the long night, this looming danger threatening to come from the north. But we're not talking about Aegon the Protector nor Aegon the Savior. And I know one of the many titles of the Kings of Westeros is Protector of the Realm, but we're talking about Aegon the Conqueror. And he's like the most legendary king in the Seven Kingdoms. Everybody looks up to him pretty much in one way or another. Even those who hate the Targaryens, they have this weird fascination, admiration mixed with fear and hate towards him. Wouldn't it have been easier for him to just protect the realm without having to conquer it? To use diplomacy and warn the other kingdoms about the upcoming danger? Why wouldn't they believe him? He has dragons, and there's historical evidence of the long night that has happened before. Hence, the whole existence of the North, the Wall, the Starks, etc. Imperialism conquest comes with the false promise that those conquered will be under the protection of the empire. Violence is a price that must be paid for stability, unity, and salvation, especially from those who come from a superior race, whose veins are full of a blood so special that they can control dragons. It is presented in the show several times, especially in the House of the Dragons, how Targaryens see themselves as kind of gods. And talking about the real medieval history from where George R.R. Martin takes inspiration from, it was understood that monarchs and those who belong to nobility have a special anointment from God, which makes their ancestry a mark of legitimacy to the high positions their families have in society. It was understood until very recently that the blood of those who are part of those classes, the nobility, the royal families, as special, that kept the secrets of their power and inheritance, that they must keep protected by relating and forming families with people of similar social status. And even in today's modern world, we still have similar beliefs. We still have monarchies who barely dare to marry commoners or people that come from working class backgrounds. And in the few instances they do, it is presented as a sign of modernity of these monarchies, like them sacrificing themselves to spoil this ancestral blood in order for them to show the commoners, like, hey, be grateful. But most of them still only mingle in tight social circles, and concepts like old money versus new money are still connected with ancestry and blood. That's why a common joke when talking about those who belong to nobility, the monarchy, and the highest class echelons of our society is to describe them as inbred. All European royal families are inbred in one way or another, even like in modern times, all noble families in Europe share the same three German ancestors. In the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, which great house in Westeros is the one with the purest blood and highest purpose? The Targaryens. Not understanding their purpose was the reason of the fall of the Targaryen, a purpose that sometimes felt like a burden to them. It is intentional in the books that prophecy is often misunderstood, and also that prophecy doesn't necessarily guarantee that those who have to carry such prophecy are morally good. The Targaryens are not good people. The Targaryen madness and cruelty were not punishments, but a price they had to pay to keep their blood pure so they could have dragons and eventually bring the savior of the world, the prince that was promised. Now let's talk about Targaryens and Valyrians. The thread that connects this colossal world together is Aegon's dream prophecy, which is explicitly said in House of the Dragon Season 1, Episode 1, the prince that was promised, and it is the responsibility of the House Targaryen to make sure this legendary prince comes to the world to save it from doom and destruction. Because a Targaryen must be in the throne, a Targaryen must conquer Westeros for this prophecy to happen. The Targaryens are rulers of Westeros were the worst. With a few exceptions, they were mostly incompetent, violent, with a strong proclivity to madness, who idealized old Valyria, an empire built on unspeakable crimes, cruel magic, slavery, fire, and blood, which helped them control the dragons. I'm not gonna get deeper into which crimes they had to commit to be able to control the dragons, but let's say that I could get my video taken down. This civilization, this horrible place, Valeria, is the ancestral origin of the promised savior of humanity, who will stop the long night from taking over the entire world, who will protect the world from death and darkness. And George R.R. Martin intentionally presents most of his characters as morally gray, capable of committing unspeakable crimes, to challenge how characters are often portrayed in a very black and white morality in the medieval fantasy genre. The Targaryens are not traditional heroes. I will go as far as to say that they're not heroes at all. Not even the good Targaryens, who are often consumed by their bad decisions, madness, and ambitions. King Jaehaerys once told me that madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. Every time a new Targaryen is born, he said, the gods toss the coin in the air and the world holds its breath to see how it will land. Why must Westeros be consumed by imperialism so it can't be protected? Why is the only way to protect humanity to follow the strict lines of noble houses and the monarchy, whose members are just horrible people at worst, whose members are morally gray at best, people who only care for their family's ambitions, wealth, glory, and honor? Let's talk about the high lords versus the small folks. The intense depravity of this unjust system that holds up the ruling houses of Westeros, social inequality, the suffering exploitation of the small folk, are presented as a necessary evil so the system can keep going because without them, there can't be powerful houses who rule over them. Occasionally, there could be benevolent lords and kings, but without changing the injustices that come from a rigid social caste system. Any minimal alteration, too much concessions to the small folk, would destroy the balance in this type of system. No one on these noble houses care for the well being and liberation of the small folk. How high can a small folk go on this Westerosi stiff class system? There are few of those who, coming from very humble origins, rise in the class system, but there are not examples of how the system is not as unjust. On the contrary, they must display extraordinary talents at the right place and the right time. They must be extremely lucky in order for them to get a fraction of what those who come from noble houses get just due to the virtue of their family origin given to them in a silver platter. If there's someone in the Game of Thrones universe more deserving of being rewarded, is Sir Duncan the Tall. He's an orphan child who lived in the slums of Flea Bottom to becoming one of the most famous and accomplished knights in Westeros history. We need to keep in mind when we talk about characters like the Onion Knight, Sir Duncan the Tall, Lord Varys, also we need to keep in mind our survival bias. Lord Barris is someone that he comes from like a very, very humble origins. He's someone who has experienced a lot of hardship and horrible things in his life, to be honest, which I will not get into details because then I will have this video taken down. He's someone who had to do a lot of things, a lot of unspeakable things to climb to the top. He's someone ambitious. He's playing the game. He doesn't want to destroy the game. An example of his cruelty is that he has this network of spies that he calls his spiders. And mostly they're children. And he will go as far as removing the tongues. Those are children. Those are poor children from Flea Bottom, the most vulnerable and neglected members of Westerosi society. Like European noble houses, past and current, Westerosi noble houses have common ancestors due to centuries of intermarriages. Even when they're not as inbred as the Targaryens, all these families are almost cousins. If someone like Sir Duncan the Tall or someone who has also worked very hard to go up and get some sort of wealth or justice in the system, they are exceptions to the rule. And if you notice, they still have challenges to marry people who come from those higher houses. If the system becomes too just, it will completely destroy the entire system. We've seen it in the show and also in this universe when some of the rulers become a little too sympathetic to the small folks or give them too many concessions. Like the high lords immediately start complaining because they're like, wait a minute, you giving them a little more fairer part of the wealth, that's wealth that we're stealing from them that we're not gonna get in our pockets. If we say that everybody's equal, that both low-born and high-born are the same, then that means that the blood of the highborn is not that special. And I find that so hypocritical because, especially in the A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, there are some of those noble houses that despise the Targaryens because they see them as oppressors who come from a foreign land, who think they're better than everyone else. But also, isn't that kind of hypocritical for them to say that because also they see themselves as their blood to be special and as their blood to be anointed by the gods, therefore the reason why they have access to all of this wealth. Again, if we make the system more equal, then they're not that special and they don't want to challenge the system because they will also lose not only their wealth but also their power because their power also resides in their family lines, in their family names. Imperialism makes this world feel so small sometimes because you have this world that is full of There's magic and cultures, but this magic is not presented as the actual force that rules above it all, but the forces that need imperialist conquest to protect the mortal world, that they need imperialism so the prince that was promised, according to Aegon's dreams, can come and protect everybody. It is always presented in the show that the small folk are people who are kind of not so intelligent, like they don't understand what's happening outside of their everyday lives, that the small folk don't care about the fights and schemings of the ruling classes, but to have a good life. One can easily understand that the small folk are tired and exhausted of this constant, endless cycle of imperialist battles where they are at the worst receiving and victims of the worst atrocities and crimes against humanity without any of the spoils and benefits that could come from these wars, regardless of which side they belong to. Are they presented as a class with valid concerns which must be addressed and liberated from the oppression the system inflicts onto them due to their class? Or just a clueless mass that doesn't understand the bigger purpose, the bigger picture? Those who come from the humblest origins, like Lord Varys, they will not liberate their peers in class because they have improved their social status. They don't care. How many thousands, like Lord Varys, like Sir Duncan the Tall, like Mysaria, have tried to improve their social standing but fail? How many hundreds have tried to play the game but didn't assess the dangers properly and forgot the weaknesses of their social standing? Now let's talk about the wildlings. The wildlings are the closest we have in Westeros society that challenges the current class system. Keep in mind that the word wildlings is an exonym created by the Westerosi world south of the wall to name the free folk. Their name is the free folk, so for the rest of this part, I will refer to them as the free folk. The north of the wall questions the order of the world south of the wall. It's a place where you have all of these clans who have different social structures within them, but it's a place where women can rule. Also, it's a place that is very rough. There's also injustice in other ways. In the Game of Thrones universe, it's presented that once you get to know how that part of that region works, there has been a lot of prejudice that is not as disorganized as how people believe they were. That the reason why people come south of the wall is because they are refugees, they're escaping from the White Walkers. But here's the thing, even though it's not presented as very black and white, even though it's presented as, yeah, this is a more organized society, also I feel George R.R. Martin used the free folk as a way to explore prejudice and xenophobia and how, there's a big difference between what you being told all of your life about a group of people and what they actually are. At the same time, it still doesn't challenge the theme of imperialism because a lot of them escape to south of the wall as refugees. This is something that Jon Snow understands, that they are not necessarily trying just to conquer and kill everybody, but they are under the constant threat of the White Walkers. And the White Walkers are part of this long night that is coming. And he understands that, yes, we have to kind of work together. But also, the free folk is a reminder for the rest of the Westerosi society that you still need imperialism to be protected, that they're not as protected as you are from the long night because they're not under the protection of Aegon the Conqueror, because they are not part of the realm. That is their punishment. Their punishment for deciding to be free, because also we know some members of the Night Watch will desert to the free folk and become members of the different clans and groups and societies that build this very diverse place that the north of the wall is that you will be the first victims of the long night that comes from the north. They are under the constant threat of extinction because of the White Walkers. They need Daenerys Targaryen, an imperialist, to save them, to protect them. They need the dragons. Now let's talk about Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys Targaryen is the most extraordinary character in the Game of Thrones universe, bringing the dragons back after hundreds of years, having raised a powerful army with almost no resources at the beginning, politically talented, with a thirst for justice and fairness. On her shoulders rests the heavy burden of the future of the Targaryen dynasty and the protection of the known world from darkness and destruction. How is she going to break the wheel as she said she will? Can the monarchy as a system be reformed? Is this what she's going to bring? Will she use imperialism as a way to unify this vast world? Because we know that she hasn't arrived to Westeros yet, according to the books. She conquered a lot of places and she created this huge, huge empire that it was necessary for her to do so, so she could abolish slavery in the free cities. We know what happened in the Game of Thrones TV show. I don't even want to think about the ending of Game of Thrones. I'm going to pretend that it didn't happen because every time I think about it, I get annoyed. Her imperialist conquests in the free cities, in the other side of the world from Westeros, they had actually a noble purpose because she abolished slavery. And she's someone that she's trying to bring justice and fairness into the world. She is by far the most morally good characters in this Game of Thrones universe. Yes, I'm choosing to ignore what happened at the end of Game of Thrones. Daenerys Targaryen is by far the most accomplished Targaryen since Aegon the Conqueror. She's the one with the most titles in the Game of Thrones universe. She has good intentions and she's someone who wants to learn about her family, who's open to diplomacy and other forms of reaching out. She's someone who's capable of compassion, kindness, and empathy while showing strength via her leadership, strategies, and of course, dragons. But she's still an empress. And this is not a criticism against Daenerys Targaryen itself, but also it's more about how our media and how we understand the world. Yes, she need imperialism for her to accomplish her goals, and I agree with that, but who built that world? Who built that universe where imperialism is a necessary evil? Imperialism is something that can be good, can be positive. Now let's talk about the honorable Starks. I want to take a quick detour to talk a little about the Starks now that we're talking about these topics about popular characters and the system. The Starks are by far the most beloved house in the Game of Thrones universe by the fan base. Starks are conservative. They're people who believe in the values of the system, and that doesn't mean that they are necessarily naive. Because if they were naive, they wouldn't be like a great house that has survived for thousands of years. They understand that they must keep the system going because they have benefited from the system. The system have turned them into one of the greatest houses of Westeros. They understand that fulfilling their promises is the righteous side. That's the reason why they're so popular and beloved in the north, because for you to build loyalty, it's very, very hard to do so. So they do it through being a very honorable house, a house that fulfills its promises, and a house that tries to keep that very conservative, traditional connection with their ancestors. They're honorable, but they're also very practical. They tolerate it. They have turned a blind eye to some of the crimes some of their vassal houses have committed, especially depending on the context. As long as it doesn't directly threat their power and their presence as a great house that controls the North, they're fine by it. They're all about tradition, they're all about honor. Now let's talk about Dorne, the Last Kingdom. Dorne is a very interesting region in the Seven Kingdoms. They're often very neglected in the Game of Thrones TV shows. As far as I understand, they're not neglected at all in the books. They have their own lore and interesting storylines, and the way Dorne was created, pretty much where the Martell royal family comes from, is super, super badass. They were the only region of the realm that couldn't be conquered by Aegon the Conqueror. They joined the Seven Kingdoms via diplomacy, managing to keep a lot of privileges, independence, and even gaining power by joining the royal Targaryen family at a time when Targaryens had no dragons. We're talking about the Targaryens who mostly marry people in their own family or marry people who are of Valyrian descent, as we see with the Velaryon. The Martells marrying into the Targaryen royal family might seem like a reward for their tenacity, resilience, and bravery, for never bending the knee when the Targaryens were at the peak of their power. That's extremely badass. We're talking about dragons. This doesn't spare them from prejudice, discrimination, and ruin. War and intrigues claim the lives of the Princess Elia Martell and her small children. That is the price of conquest and war. The Dornishmen still live under an empire. Is there such a thing as benevolent imperialism? Will the lack of self determination always be a problem? The humiliation and reckless decision of Prince Rhaegar to escape with Lyanna Stark to fulfill this prophecy that will save humanity reminds me a lot of Greek mythology. The cruelty of the gods, how they would often play with the lives of mortals, and how their madness doesn't matter because they're not humans. They're above humans, they're gods. The Targaryens see themselves one way or another as gods, as above humans. Don't emperors, kings, and queens see themselves as to be anointed by the gods? Or in some instances, as gods themselves, and that their desires are missions that must be fulfilled. Imperialism and monarchy, necessary evils. The necessary order to protect the weak, unites the realm, but within the realm fights for power, schemes, treaties, etc. A constant fight for the top. The industry of imperialism is the only constant in this world full of magic, dragons, civilizations, kingdoms, languages, ethnic groups, mysterious tales, and unexplored, magical, dark places. To let these noble houses fight for glory, a power anointed to them by the virtue of their blood, a price the small ones have to pay in order to be protected. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about this episode. What do you think about my wig? If it was a good or a bad idea. I was a little nervous because it's my first time doing this and I'm also trying something new. I intentionally didn't mention the free cities. Now I'm gonna read some of your comments that you left on my previous episode. It will be hard for them to find music outside of Black influence because Black people created nearly every popular music genre after classical music, at least talking about English language genres, not sure about others. From ragtime to blues, gospel, rock, R&B, jazz, and hip hop. If you're ever in Nashville, Tennessee, they have the African American Music Museum, and it's incredible and enlightening. It's easy to spend many hours there, and so many exhibits are cool and interactive. Thank you so much for the tips. Also, I just want to add that in Latin America, most music comes from Black music or indigenous music. They can only experience humanity through the perceived other because they have consumed the planet, soon the moon, and eventually the solar system, therefore themselves. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram where I share a lot of cool, interesting short format content. I'm also on Patreon where I have a lot of exclusive content. And also, I enjoy drinking coffee. If you want to buy me some coffee, thank you so much once again, and see you next time.